let's go to the national security assessment in the time remaining. Contempt for Europe, that seems to be very clear. The assessment even points out that there's
more negative said about Europe in this document than there is about either Russia or China. I mean, that cannot be avoided. They domestically politically attack. Yes. He goes after the migration policy as a civilization erasing, which, to be frank, I think their immigration policy is broken, but then again, so is the US's, right? And there's that, right? But this is political. Let's be clear. Trump comes from a almost in the modern day, at least, a new populist right or populist conservative, if you want, a political persuasion. And there are, parallels in Europe, and you can easily point to Orban in Hungary, recent, parties that were banned in Romania, candidates that were banned in Romania and elsewhere. And Trump is going after the technocratic Brussels European elite for the suppression of this conservative populist politics in Europe. And almost certainly a lot of it is personal, right? In two different elections now, two different administrations, right? Trump has seen the European political elite openly support, you could argue, interfere in U.S. elections in support of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris against him, right? I mean, there's no question. The Western media has acknowledged all of this, right? They openly said it. Starmer had people campaigning for Kamala Harris in the last election, which was just an amazing stupidity. Anyway, and Trump has just expressed his hatred and contempt for the European political elite enshrined in a U.S. major grand vision geopolitical strategy document. There's nothing like this has happened before. And this is an attempt. I don't believe any of this is going to be successful, right? And it's a theoretical, right? It's a vision document. This isn't policy itself, right? It will. The question will be, how much does this actually affect policy, right? And we'll get to that. But he signals out the greatest threat to democracy in the world being the European political elites, which, I mean, he kind of has a point. I mean, I'm not entirely disagree with it. I think maybe exaggerated a bit, but there certainly is that. They should not be able to claim any just moral justification for their actions in the world on the basis of their systemic or moral superiority because of their democratic system. That's just nonsense, right? It's hypocrisy of the highest degree at this point. So Trump has gone to war. I mean, revenge is a dish best served cold, and this is Trump's revenge, right? He has contempt for the European political elite, and he openly announced U.S. support for these populist, conservative forces in Europe in future elections. It's just amazing. But there's a lot more to it than that, right? He elevated as the top U.S. national security its own problems with borders, right? And the national security, you want to call it drug smuggling and everything else. And then the second priority would probably be the Western Hemisphere. And he has declared literally in those words a Trump corollary to the Monroe doctrine, where even as later in the document, he goes on how the U.S. sought global domination under previous administrations, right? Hegemony, right? As we've talked about many times. And that was, wrong and it was wasteful and ineffective. But he doubles down on domination for the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
Right. And goes far further, right? Referencing the Monroe doctrine in this is, again, this is the Trump trademark version of the Monroe Doctrine, which goes much further. He seems to suggest that countries in the Western Hemisphere should not even have trade relations with what the document addresses as the U.S.'s economic competitors, China and Russia, and you can't imagine that countries like Brazil, which is a significant power in the Western Hemisphere, a member of BRICS, is going to be happy having to raise their hand and ask for a hall pass to use the lavatory in geopolitical terms, right? They're just not going to accept this.
Remember BRICS.
BRICS.
Literally, BRICS.
According to Trump, BRICS is dead and everyone's left and it doesn't exist anymore. But I said this weekend on another on RT, there's two big undeclared enemies in this, because Russia is not identified as an enemy, as an adversary, as anything. That is simply a country that Russia needs to restore strategic stability with. And the biggest obstacle that is those Europeans, right? I mean, that's said straight out. China has kind of been lowered on the priority list. It's still identified as a major competitor, and he wants to keep the status quo with Taiwan, but he also hints that U.S. allies in the Pacific, i.e. Japan and the Philippines, need to do more of the same burden sharing, and they need to step up as the proxies against China in the Pacific, which, to be fair, that's exactly what those governments are now doing. Yes. I mean, they just want to be the next Ukraine, I guess. But, so the U.S. kind of steps back in a position and pushes in the Pacific and pushes its proxies forward to the front. That's what's going on there. But there's two big unidentified, unnamed enemies to Trump's grand strategic vision here. And when I say Trump, the real author of this is Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Strategic Planning. And I did a video on him months ago that really identified where all of this was going to go, I think pretty well, because he was already working on some lesser strategic papers to that effect several months ago. So this was all entirely predictable that it was likely coming out the chute. So the first one is BRICS, right? Because it's not just that he can deal with other great powers anymore on a one-on-one basis. They ally and coordinate together, right? How can he dominate Brazil, in the way he foresees in the Western Hemisphere when it's part of the BRICS, when it's allied with Russia and China and India and South Africa and other countries now under BRICS Plus to a significant degree. Trump, of course, they just like to pretend that BRICS doesn't exist. And I mean, it doesn't exist to the extent that some people would like it to. It doesn't, right? It's not a military alliance or anything. But there is a multipolar vision there. It is forming nascent institutions of global governance parallel to and separate from the United States. And that should not be completely discounted. The other big one, the biggest elephant in the room, is the biggest enemy of this, which is the U.S. government. Because the number of people that agree with this strategy of this grand strategic vision, reorientation, is Trump, Vance, presumably Witkoff, maybe Dan Driscoll, and Elbridge Colby, right? That's about it. It's hard to identify other significance. Yeah. So let's see. Both major political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, the vast majority of them are against this. The bipartisan foreign policy consensus in Congress is just completely against this. The deep state, the blob, the permanent bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it, right? The State Department, the intelligence services, the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, the think tanks, everyone is against this. Right, the media, of course, calling it a betrayal of Europe and trying to cast Russia as a friend and Europe as the villain, right? All over the place. there's absolutely no hope of any of this really happening, because it will be blocked, if not by Europe, and starting a war with Russia in Ukraine directly, which is certainly something they seem to be heading towards. But the U.S. government will sabotage and overrule this at every possibility. They do not agree with this reinterpretation of U.S. hegemony, right? This retrenchment, this Fortress America in the Western Hemisphere, still seeking to exert dominance, but from a remove, from afar, through proxies only, right? That's Trump's vision, and it's a radical reorientation, but it's very unlikely to happen. The only possibility of this being cemented is if Vance follows Trump, and then maybe even he would need 2 terms. Only then would this really start to gel. And the Europeans are absolutely horrified, of course. They're just apoplectic over all of this. They have no, they're going to have a meeting today on how to react to it, because that's all they're capable of doing, is having meeting after meeting, right? They're just going to roll over and play dead and try to ignore it. And just, they've got a clock in their rooms. I'm sure that Starmer and Merz and Macron all have a timer in their bedrooms on the countdown till Trump's term is over, right? They just want to run out the clock, right? And they will, they're, according to Bloomberg, they're actively telling Ukraine at this point, agree nothing on the peace process with the U.S., right? Just, hold out in Donbass, hold out everywhere, just hold out. In 2030, we'll be ready for war with Russia. So just hang on till then, right? That's literally what they're saying to Ukraine right now. I don't have any hope for the peace process, and I don't. Again, some people are trying to paint this as a good thing, right? It's not a good thing. It's a different thing. It's a different flavor of a still hegemonic beast, right? More focused on some things, less focused on other things. It's better for Russia in theory, right? In policy and practice, we'll see how much of it enacts, right? And maybe less pressure on China. You could possibly see it going that way. But if you're in the Western Hemisphere, you're now a Trump subject, evidently, right? So it's not a good thing. It is a different thing. It is a hegemonic retrenchment, right? That's the vision. But it's very unlikely. The U.S. deep state, right? The blob, they're going to stonewall and sabotage and block this being implemented in policy for the next 3.5 years. Remember Trump in his first administration trying to pull troops out of Syria and Afghanistan? Yeah, that didn't happen. This is also unlikely to happen. They're now demanding, seemingly completely in line with this, that Europe be self-sufficient on defense by 2027, right? Which is also unlikely to happen from either a European side or America withdrawing troops from Europe, but it certainly scares them, right? And again, that's part of the division of labor, the burden sharing of Western hegemony. But the whole argument from Western hegemony largely goes, US-led Western hegemony largely goes out, with the bathwater with this, because they're picturing the entire current European political elite as enemies of the Trump administration, which, to be fair, certainly in this, they are. So, that whole division and burden sharing thing appears to be, even that. If this was enacted, it wouldn't work out.
Be careful what you ask for. Like, the entire point of NATO was for the United States to be able to control and guide European foreign policy.
U.S. in Europe, Germany down, and Russia out. That was the whole original purpose of NATO, and still is to a large extent. But NATO is not mentioned in this document. Ideology, human rights, democracy promotion, the whole democratic states versus authoritarian states, that's all on the cutting room floor. That's not U.S. policy anymore, according to this U.S. national security strategy. That's all fascinating. The implications of this is huge. As an international relations theory specialist, this is all extremely interesting and exciting to me, even if I don't think it's actually possible to implement in policy realistically for the Trump administration. Just imagining the alt history, fan fiction reality where this actually becomes U.S. foreign policy. I mean, that's interesting to envisage that world, even if I don't believe it's actually going to happen.
Yeah. What would that mean for Europe in that alt fiction world? I mean, because this is effectively a new security architecture of Europe.
They're talking about the death of Europe. Europe is in civilizational decline. It's not able to innovate. It's economically moribund and collapsing. Even it's not able to defend itself either, militarily, even in will to power. Yes, a strategic liability. That is a good summation. I saw Simplicius the Thinker use exactly that expression, and yeah, it sums it. I mean, that takes all the contempt out of it, right? I mean, that's a very technical terminology. And again, right. I think a lot of this is personal for Trump. I think a lot of this is personal. But yes, in summation in technical terms, yeah, that's a good way of looking at how this document deals with Europe and what they see. They see Europe as a strategic liability. And again, the Europeans are just they're still in shock. I mean, their jaws are still on the floor. They can't believe this is happening to them. This is what their whole servile routine to Trump, right? Their sycophancy, that strategy of dealing with Trump this time around, has been to prevent this from happening. And despite them rolling over, playing dead, and saying, "Daddy, Daddy," none of that has had any effect, and this has still come out, with all of the contempt and the vitriol and the scorn that Trump is capable of now as supposedly a U.S. national security strategy. Now, that in the bowels of Langley and the Pentagon and everything, they don't believe and they don't intend to follow, any of this. But again, the chaos bomb the Trump chaos bomb spinning around, is going off on the transatlantic relationship, again, within the U.S. itself, because ultimately this will be a battle again against the deep state, right? In a non-literal, sense, of course.
Yeah.
But I mean, they just will not implement this. They will do everything possible to limit, its implementation. And I'm very interested. I haven't heard personally from Elbridge Colby since this was announced, but he is the intellectual force behind this, right? He penned this. So I'll be interested to see what he thinks. I'd also be very interested to hear Mearsheimer's take on this, because I actually think that Mearsheimer, from a strictly non-emotionally attached, right, realist point of view, would identify this as the best policy for the United States. Again, but I think he would also agree there's very little chance of it actually being implemented. But I'll be interested to hear what Mearsheimer has to say about this.
One last question. I could have swore something was in a document about NATO expansion being part of the destabilization of Europe.
Yeah, he absolutely said that. That was one of the only references. He said that NATO must stop a policy of continual expansion. He didn't say Russia shouldn't expand into Ukraine. There was hedge words there, right? But he says that the expansion, the eternal or the continual expansion of NATO is having a destabilizing effect on Europe, essentially, meaning relations with Russia, essentially, right, is what he's saying there. So that's, again, we know he doesn't like NATO, and I don't think he has the capability to pull out of NATO. But if he did, I'm sure, if he did have that capability, I'm sure he would do it. He has as much contempt for NATO as an institution as he does for the European Union.
Okay, I lied. One last question. Russia, everything that I've been reading in Russian media looks at this favorably.
Oh, yeah. Too favorably, but yeah. From Russia's perspective, this is opportunity, right? They see it was identified as a top priority, a top strategic priority to end the conflict in Ukraine as, quote, expeditiously as possible. Russia's like, we can get whatever we want, right? They're desperate, right? And they're dividing with Europe and everything. Russia's going to see this. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to result in a settlement deal because the Europeans and the Kiev is going to sabotage everything. But as far as Russia is concerned, well, now there's their opportunity. It does not appear, at least at the moment, that Trump has any attempt of wading back into this in a serious way. And so if it continues on the battlefield, and they're more confident now about, getting everything
their devices
and more out of this. And I have to imagine that from a position of the Kremlin and Beijing, that they're sitting in the theater with their 3D glasses on, and they're like taking them on and off and checking them that they're working right. And then Putin's turning to Xi Jinping and saying, pass the popcorn. This is a great flick. Because they see the U.S. hegemonic beast having identity issues right now, which, again, whether this actually became U.S. foreign policy or not, just the internal conflict and the transatlantic conflict and chaos that will result from this is to their advantage, right? So
interesting. Very interesting. Mark, man, always appreciate you, man. I really do. Great breakdown, as always. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can find Mark on Boosty, Boosty. All of his content is going to be there. All of the interviews that he does are going to be there. He's one of the best people in this field, so definitely check him out. You can also find him on Twitter at Mark Sleboda. Mark, you have a great rest of your day, man. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. All right. Shout out